Ok, vous pouvez m'entendre? Ah, pardon. Okay, that's the book I published in 2020, and I'm going to speak a little bit about that today, but I'm going to go beyond that with things that have happened, I think, in the last year, especially in the last few weeks. I'm going to, not surprisingly, talk a little bit about Putin's, I think, idea of civilization. Okay, so with that in mind, it's not quite as strange as the first sounds. I think it's worth curving back to talk about this. Let me go ahead and start by saying that one of the most surprising features of 21st century international politics has been the widespread pleas to protect civilization in crisis. Of course, its dubious and destructive heritage is well known to all of us, but in recent years, the idea of safeguarding civilization in danger has enjoyed a remarkable renaissance around the world, not least among leaders of major powers, these days invoking the defense of civilization is common currency in the political rhetoric of Chinese President Xi Jinping, Turkish President Erdogan, French President, of course, Emmanuel Macron, Narendra Modi in India, and of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and it was the case with Donald Trump as well. Now, at first, this may seem like it's just kind of recycled update of Huntington's infamous thesis of the clash of civilizations for our time, but I think things are very different today. For the language of civilization in crisis has generally become at once more global and more defensive, and bespeaks a deeper critique of a Western-dominated liberal order that rejects older internationalisms in favor of the fortification of state sovereignty under perceived threat. So prevalent has this terminology become that academics, especially political scientists, now speak of the development of the so-called civilizational state as a hybrid of culture and power politics. Perhaps best noted in Christopher Cocker's 2019 book, The Rise of the Civilizational State, with an emphasis on India and China. Now, since the shock of 9/11, the so-called fight for civilization suffused the speeches of American Republican Party presidents from George W. Bush through Donald Trump in connection with the war on terrorism. And recent crises in Europe have prompted numerous European politicians to sound the alarm about European civilization in peril. In the wake of the November 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris, for example, French Interior Minister Manuel Valls, as you may remember, described the conflict with ISIS as what he called un combat de valeurs, un combat de civilisation. And more recently, in a speech at the Ambassadors' Conference in August of 2019, Macron insisted that France needed to preserve Europe's civilization project from both internal and external menace. On the other side of Europe, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has repeatedly proclaimed that refugees from Syria and elsewhere have threatened Europe's, what he calls, Christian roots and Europe's civilization. Political figures in Poland, Austria, Holland, Denmark, Serbia, Germany, and the UK have voiced similar anxiety about Europe's fragile frontiers, cultural identity, and Christian civilization under mortal threat. And of course, Vladimir Putin has openly enlisted the language of a distinct Russian civilization as a rebuff to American-style globalization and as a means to justify military expansion in the Ukraine, first in 2014, and again in his infamous essay published last July in 2021 on Russian-Ukrainian relations, in which he uses the civilization language quite directly and repeatedly. And of course, also in his recent speeches, you probably noticed this is the kind of leitmotif of some of the points he's making. And it's also worth remembering that ISIS's detonation of Palmyra in August 2015 was denounced as desecrations of what was called world civilization by voices in Europe, the Middle East, and by international organizations like UNESCO. Even more disturbing, the last few years have witnessed the racist ramping up of the defense of what is now called white civilization as a rallying cry for the radical right across Europe and North America, which was manifest in the violent rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in 2017, and then again 2 years later in the online manifesto by the killer responsible for the mosque killing in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. Now, renewed interest in the defense of civilization may be back with shrill intensity, yet there's little sense of how we got here. What I hope to offer you today are some historical reflections on the roots of this predicament, casting attention back to the widely discussed crisis of civilization in Europe after 1945. Now, one of the reasons, I think, that we're so ill-equipped to grasp what is happening is because civilization is a term we love to hate. Now, for many, and I should say as a kind of spoiler alert, I'm not here to advocate the rehabilitation of the term. I'm in a sense just trying to understand how it works historically and politically over the last 75 years, and especially for the present. Now, for many, civilization is an irredeemably dirty word, forever contaminated by 18th century elitism, and of course 19th century imperialism, racism, and religious intolerance, which of course are still there in myriad forms till today. Now, for many, the 20th century's grim inheritance of 2 world wars, the Holocaust and decolonization, forever buried Europe's sense of cultural supremacy in the world. British historian Tony Judd was certainly not alone when he wrote that Nazism and its genocidal politics has rendered European civilization what he called the grandest of all illusions. But it did not fade away and has persisted as a key term for narrating perceived political crisis since 1945. Yet it is striking that we do not subject the term civilization to the same historical scrutiny that we do other toxic terms like race, racism, and white privilege. This is a pity, since the strong emotions associated with the concept have animated public discourse in various ways for a century and a half, and were especially prevalent after the Second World War as fantasies of re-civilization fueled new political visions of how Europe's damaged cultural traditions could be revived and preserved. Now, what further obscures our understanding is that histories of civilization typically chart kind of rise and fall stories, such as the work of Arnold Toynbee and others, but there's surprisingly little literature on how civilizations remake themselves after they have fallen. And Europe is a good case of that. After all, the physical and moral collapse of 1945 opened up the possibility of seeing and thinking about Europe differently, as competing claims about the meaning and direction of civilization underlay the politics of Reconstruction. Right-wing campaigns to reclaim civilization as their own certainly were present in the form of muscular Christianity, the defense of empire, and anti-Americanism. But these views were often met by equally powerful counterclaims about the new Europe from liberals, Eastern European socialists, anti-colonial intellectuals and radicals, UNESCO, preservationists, and other reformers. Its radical appropriation by today's conservatives and even neo-fascists overshadows the ways in which civilization emerged as a favorite metaphor for building a new and better Europe after the war, often in the name of peace, justice, decolonization, and multiculturalism. Now, at this point, there's no need to rehearse the evolution of the term from 18th century France to the mid-century, and you'll be pleased to hear that I will not be recapitulating its kind of historical semantics of the word in German, French, English, and Italian context since the Enlightenment, however interesting that is. But what distinguished the 20th century notion of civilization from its historical predecessors was the explicit linkage to cultural crisis. It was no accident that the most serious commentators on the meaning of civilization, that's Lucien Febvre, Norbert Elias, Arnold Toynbee, and of course the late work of Sigmund Freud, were all writing in the 1930s. Civilization is the most European of ideologies and the most cherished of invented traditions, and it is often most pronounced in times of danger and disorder. While we generally think of the material stuff of civilization as durable, continuous, ever-present, and even timeless, it is well to remember that the custodial claims to its inheritance are typically sounded during periods of major upheaval and perceived cultural disarray. This is certainly the case in Europe following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and again after both world wars. The point is that the concern about the fate of civilization is therefore less the product of peace and prosperity than the result of rupture, vulnerability, and the drive for change. So it was in that way the very corruption and the fragility of European civilization itself after the war that energized a diverse set of thinkers, politicians, activists, and reformers to try to rescue it from the ruins of war, destruction, and again, moral collapse. So after 1945, a remarkable wide network of people engaged in this reconstruction of civilization across the Iron Curtain and even in the ex-colonies in the name of renewal and reform, ranging from warmongers to peaceniks, traditionalists to liberal modernizers, scientists to humanitarian aid workers, Christian conservatives to communists, nationalists to internationalists, and European imperialists and African anti-imperialists. Now, some of these people saw civilization as singular and universal, others as plural and separate. But what all parties identified in this contest for civilization was that it was urgent and necessary. Now, what is especially striking is that after 1945, the whole discussion of Europe was much broader than ever before, as well as much less elitist and even Eurocentric, as various advocates and critics invoked civilization as synonymous with peace, expanded welfare states, social solidarity, and refined everyday interaction. Civilization therefore moved beyond being an abstract idea or the stuff of philosophizing and encompassed a broad range of practical and concrete reform initiatives to begin anew. That said, civilization's very tricky to define. The eminent art historian Kenneth Clark opened his 1969 blockbuster BBC television program on civilization, whose accompanying book was sold to some 60 countries, by confessing, what is civilization? I don't know. I can't define it in abstract terms, but I think I can recognize it when I see it, so he said. Do you have, oh, sorry. There we are, the Kenneth Clark, that's a still from the program from 1969. Now, whatever one makes of Clark's kind of breezy, patrician self-confidence in judging what does or does not count as civilization, Clark put his finger on the tricky problem of identifying what exactly civilization is. For Clark and many others, it was synonymous with a canon of venerable cultural artifacts in the arts and sciences, the unique material inheritance of a people or culture, in this case, a kind of Western cultural patrimony that stretched back to ancient Greece. Now, for others, of course, civilization is better understood as the cultural fruit of urban life, that is roads in central states, food production and hospitals, cargo ships, and cathedral. And I just wanted to point that the program at BBC in 2018, sponsored by these, or narrated by these three historians, David Ulusuga, Mary Beard, and Simon Shauna, was an effort to respond to Kenneth Clark's program, which is put civilization in the plural, not just as a singular entity, and also in a sense a story of interaction and hybridity as a way of responding to this idea of kind of regional separate civilizations, in which is also, for Kenneth Clark, a kind of natural hierarchy. So it's very much a kind of idea of civilizations for our time. Now again, if some people embrace civilization as a story of edification and inclusion, others saw it very differently. For more than a century, the Western European left summarily rejected the ideology of civilization as nothing but window dressing, masking Western imperialism, domination, and barbarities of all sorts. For those on the receiving end of European expansion and colonial conquest, the line between civilization and barbarism seemed to be so thin as to be indistinguishable. Mahatma Gandhi, he has a famous quip in which he was at one point supposedly asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he said, "Sounds like a good idea." Meaning it captured this widespread sense of hypocrisy and the violence inherent in the whole European enterprise itself. Nevertheless, these sort of objections overlook two key issues. The first is that Western civilization was never unified or consistent, whose history has been marked by perennial doubt and self-criticism from various quarters since the 18th century, and most acutely after 1945. Secondly, the aspiration of civilization was never completely dismissed by anti-colonial intellectuals, as we'll see. The point is that civilization did not die at Auschwitz, but instead re-emerged as a central concept to ascribe positive meaning to physical and moral reconstruction after the war, first in Western Europe and then surprisingly later in Eastern Europe. What I discovered was that the new mission to re-civilize Europe was by no means confined to conservatives, but rather was seized upon by a surprising array of competing causes and interest groups. I mean, for example, the term African civilization was deployed by African intellectuals in places like Ghana, Algeria, and Senegal to advance the cause of anti-colonialism, and Eastern European socialists in the 1960s popularized the idea of what they call socialist civilization as a bridge of solidarity with the developing world. In each case, civilization was identified as a key concept for thinking and acting transnationally, since its reach far exceeded the political boundaries of any nation state. Now, such a broad understanding of regional civilizations sits in stark contrast to its usage today, as civilization in crisis rhetoric is usually invoked, especially by contemporary political leaders, as a defense of the nation state, a theme to which I'm going to return at the very end. So to illustrate the story, I'm going to look at three brief examples. The first is the birth of the United Nations in 1945, which inaugurated the most ambitious experiment in 20th century internationalism. That spring, a large assembly of people from around the world gathered in San Francisco to launch a new mission of world peace under the auspices of the United Nations Conference on International Organization. Delegates from 51 countries came together in the coastal city's cavernous opera house in May and June of 1945, flanked by representatives from over 250 international organizations. The New York Post went so far as to call it the most important human gathering since the Last Supper. Now, Field Marshal Jan Christian Smuts, the South African Prime Minister and one of the delegates who had taken part in the creation of the League of Nations 20 years before, captured the solemnity of the occasion in his opening address. And he said, "For the human race, the hour has struck. Mankind has arrived at the crisis of its fate, the fate of its future as a civilized world, for whom a new charter must be based on what he called a faith in justice and the resolve to vindicate the fundamental rights of man." Now, at first, this kind of soaring invocation of civilization at the UN may seem strange, given that it's often argued that the transition from the League of Nations to the United Nations marked the shift from the old language of civilization to the more concrete language of individual rights and collective security. After all, the League's infamous distinction between the family of civilized nations and the rest of the world was dropped in all UN documents, and civilization as a foundational moral norm was expunged from all conference resolutions. Yet the language of civilization did not disappear and was used by other advocates to press for reform and international justice. African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, who, like Smuts, was present at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, raised the stakes by saying that the United Nations Charter should, quote, make clear and unequivocal the straightforward stand of the civilized world for race equality in order to save human civilization from suicide, since what he said was true of the United States in the past is true of world civilization today. We cannot exist half slave and half free. In his hands, as well as other like-minded critics, the appeal to civilization was political leverage to hold powerful states to account. Others, however, saw the mission of civilization defensively. British UN delegate Robert Gascoigne Cecil, Viscount Cranbourne, insisted that a post-war settlement must be based on divisions between people of different races, people of different religions, and people of different stages of civilization. Now, such divergent examples illustrate how varied ideas of civilization swirled around San Francisco, signified anything from European to universal, radical change to conservative restoration, colonialism to anti-colonialism. Now, it is well known that the most ambitious dreams of renewal and regeneration at San Francisco met with bitter disappointment. Women's lobby groups at the conference were frustrated by the ways in which implementing the peace in the name of security and welfare were severely circumscribed. And here you have, sorry, that was, this is Bodil, a Beg group from Denmark pushing on the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in 1948, but they were there in 1945 as well, pushing on the idea of more gender equality. That Smuts, the South African premier and longtime champion of segregation and white settler rule, was the figure most responsible for the UN's lofty preamble, was greeted by critics as ironic and hypocritical. Du Bois acidly remarked that, quote, we have conquered Germany, but not their ideas. We still believe in white supremacy, keeping Negroes in their place and lying about democracy when we mean imperial control of 750 million people in the colonies. So for all the augurs of starting afresh, the United Nations was largely designed to steady a shaken imperial order. Even so, the disappearance of civilization from international law hardly spelled the demise as a term of engagement. Rather, claims of civilization moved their way to other domains in European public discussions, including humanitarianism, international justice, empire, science, religion, and material welfare. Now, unsurprisingly, the campaign to recast Europe in the immediate aftermath of the war focused on Germany. This could be seen in two ways. First, the shocking encounter with the devastation of war across the continent, as well as the liberation of the concentration camp, incited countless ruminations on the collapse of civilization in zero-hour Europe. Foreign observers, Christian missionaries, charity workers, and international relief agents from the newly created United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, or UNRWA for short, bore witness to a Europe in ruins and were at the front line of material and moral rehabilitation of the continent. I'm just going to show you photographs from some of the groups. This is, again, some of the Catholic relief services. They were very kind of staged photographs of handing out kind of food parcels in Germany in 1945. Again, more Catholic relief services giving aid to the infirmed expellees in 1945. There are a number of Quaker organizations, of course, also on the ground. And then you have, in this case, UNRWA doling out food to Jewish DPs, in this case in Austria in 1946. And then another one where aid distributed to Italian children in 1946 as well. And this often uses kind of language of the kind of re-civilization of Europe. So their presence marked the full reversal of Europe's 19th century civilizing mission. Europe, long the energetic missionary power in all parts of the globe, had itself become the site of new missionary activity and outside influence. So foreign relief agencies, both religious and secular, dispensed aid to those who had suffered under Axis occupation and cared for expellees and displaced persons across Central and Southern Europe, and did so often in the name of re-civilizing Europe. Secondly, and most famously, this re-civilizing mission also included military occupation and other measures of punishment and international justice. The language of civilization suffused the Nuremberg trials, for example. In his opening speech, U.S. Supreme Court Justice and Chief Counsel for the Allied Prosecution, Robert Jackson, opened that tribunal by stating that, quote, "The real complaining party at your bar is civilization. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating," Jackson continued, "that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." And here's a photograph here of Robert Jackson then in action. Military occupation and the ensuing campaign to re-educate vanquished Germans and Austrians followed a similar logic. The point is that the fate of defeated Germany, its leaders, victims, and vanquished empire framed early Allied discussions of the remaking of occupied Europe, whose pacification ensured that the Cold War stayed cold. There were other events that elicited wide discussion about civilization in crisis. The dawning of atomic warfare sparked lively interest in Europe about the fate of planetary civilization, as it was called, and gave rise to the creation of a number of new organizations and peace movements across the Iron Curtain that aimed to civilize science as a source of peace and international cooperation. This is called the Atom Train that was traveling around Britain in 1948 in a sense to promote the domestic and beneficiary effects of atomic energy. Such politicking could also be seen in the visions to revive the continent from the perspective of militant Christianity. In the 1940s, the churches, driven by a resurgent Catholic Church under Pope Pius XII, led the charge in reasserting their role in redrawing the cultural geography of Cold War Europe around the frontiers of faith, Christian democracy, and a new definition of the West. The reparation of damaged cathedrals and the building of modern churches across Western Europe was seen as key instances of the re-Christianization of the continent. And you have a lot of books like this, where this is from a photo book produced about Cologne in the late 1940s, this kind of symbolic idea of Christ emerging from the rubble. The defense of Christian civilization, even what a term very popular in the 1950s, Judeo-Christian civilization, was central to this mission. And this became also a very important instance. This is the show trial of Cardamon Senti of Hungary in 1949, in which he was accused of extortion, links to the West, and even trying to restore the Habsburg family in Hungary at the time. So this trial was very much an enormously important issue, not just for the international Catholic community, but it was one in which the Christian community, lots of Protestants, were very engaged with this and became also an important talking point at the United Nations. So early on, you look at the history of human rights, the right to religious freedom became an important early indication of what people meant by human rights in the 1940s. And this was against the backdrop also against the Chinese Revolution, in which the idea of the kind of loss of Christian China was seen then that we have to do our best to support the fate of Christians behind the Iron Curtain. So the kind of Senti trial became a kind of lightning rod for this international discussion about the defense of Christian civilization in the 1950s. Conservative Western European ideas about the revival of the kind of neo-medieval Abendland, or the land of the West, helped to overcome confessional divides between Catholics and Protestants in the fight against godless communism, and to ward off the undue influence of the United States as well. So moreover, a secular idea of Western civilization, that's different from Christian civilization. A secular idea of Western civilization in danger was exploited by American military and cultural authorities in the United States and Western Europe in a new transatlantic alliance, best evidenced in the Marshall Plan and in the Greek Civil War. Think about the language used by Truman and George Kennan, the idea of justifying this new kind of military and economic umbrella over Western Europe in the name of Western civilization. So that language becomes then a legitimation for, in a sense, the military occupation of Western Europe. Now, of course, I'll leave that for the moment. The call to civilization also found expression in the explosion of etiquette books written in the 1950s across Europe at the time, both in the East and West, as emblems of a post-war society based on peace, prosperity, courtesy, and respect. And just to kind of show you this the kind of cottage industry of these books. This is from an East German manners manual in the 1950s, in a sense, how to behave, how to greet people, how to shake their hands. The idea that people are coming out of a militant war society, they in a sense have to learn what it is to be a kind of courteous socialist citizen. An enormous amount of attention, in a sense, the idea of the civilization of the self in the 1950s. Now in France, the Netherlands, and of course in Belgium, civilization was also invoked in traditional ways, first to justify the restoration of European empire after 1945, and then in the 1960s as a defense against the coming of what was called at the time American civilization. I mean, in a sense, all the kind of material stuff from Hollywood, genes, film, jazz, rock and roll, etc., in both Western and Eastern Europe. Now, most of these instances, I imagine, are familiar to you, but the next two examples I would think will be more unexpected, and they concern the relationship between Europe and Africa. And they were not driven by Western Europe. Here, the central question is, what happened when the most Western European of ideologies, civilization, was transplanted and reconfigured outside of Western Europe? In this case, in Africa and in communist Eastern Europe. Or put differently, what were the effects of Western Europe's infamous legacy of civilization outside of Western Europe? Now let's start with Africa. Surprisingly, the language civilization continued to inform European-African cultural connections even after the end of empire, and was co-opted by African anti-colonial elites for new political purposes in the 1960s. This was especially the case in Ghana, Algeria, and Senegal, where the rhetoric of civilization was exploited by African national elites in their struggles against European imperialism and superpower encroachment. In their ways, these three African countries pioneered the historic mission to build new post-imperial civilizations. Such views even enjoyed support among anti-colonial thinkers who are usually seen as harsh critics of the whole enterprise of European civilization itself, people like Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire. During the Algerian War, Frantz Fanon, for example, remarked that there are civilizations without neckties, civilizations with loincloths, and others without hats. And in his classic text, Discourse on Colonialism, Césaire claimed that civilization itself was not the problem, but rather the European manipulation of it, adding, "I systematically defend our own Negro civilizations. They were courteous civilizations." The point is that this early post-war critique did not reject the concept of civilization outright, but rather maintained that civilizations were multiple and equal, in which no continent, least of all Europe, enjoyed any advanced position. The cultural politics of Senghor's Senegal is a revealing illustration of how this concept of civilization was being transformed in Europe's ex-colonies. Now, Senghor, of course, was one of the most influential African intellectuals of his generation. His ideas of African civilization were closely linked to his conception of negritude, which he once defined, quote, as the entire values of the black world, the values of the civilization of the black world, I should say. Nonetheless, Senghor also saw Europe as a prospective partner in this civilizational project. and sought to build bridges between France and Africa, what he significantly called Euro-African civilization. The pre-colonial past, long dismissed and devalued by the colonial powers, was now recast as the living heritage of modern Africa. For him, the assertion of African civilization was itself part of the effort to decolonize the African mind and to remind Africans of their great and glorious past. The opening of the high-profile First World Exhibition of Black Art in April 1966 in Dakar best captured this sensibility. This was a landmark show for African history. It was the very first international art show of African art to take place on African soil and was explicitly designed, as one publicist put it, to allow Africans to speak in their own voice. The 1966 exhibition showcased Senghor's Senegal as a modern and cultured state, as some 2,500 artists, musicians, performers, and writers gathered in Dakar to celebrate Black art across continents. Among the star-studded group, of course, is Césaire, Langston Hughes, Josephine Baker, and Wole Soyinka. There were representatives from 30 African countries on hand, together with 6 African diasporic populations, those coming from the US, Brazil, Trinidad, Tobago, the UK, and France. Now, on offer was a huge variety of art, dance, drama, and musical performances. This is Senghor himself, kind of starting to promote the show, and this is then a cover of the exhibition catalog itself. Some 600 objects, such as sculptures and masks, from over 50 museums and private collections in Africa, Europe, and North America, were proudly displayed. The show reunited many African objects for the first time across continents, and it was in this sense the show served as a spectacle of Senghor's idea of negritude. Senghor's celebration of Pan-Africanism advanced a new cultural geography of African art, one that both spanned centuries, from prehistory to the present. You have here Senghor looking at kind of objects from African antiquity, and also spanning continents, as noted in Senghor's welcoming of American jazz great Duke Ellington to actually open the show. And there you have a handshake with Duke Ellington. So the once maligned mission of civilization became a favorite rhetorical weapon to turn the tables on their former European colonizers to broadcast post-colonial arrival and sovereignty. This brings me to my third example. If heritage and civilization became key issues for African elites in the 1960s, the same thing happened with Eastern European communist elites at the time, which focused on decolonizing Africa too. This may seem surprising on several levels. After all, the Soviet Union and its satellite states traditionally greeted the concept of civilization with skepticism and disdain. In fact, communists routinely dismissed Western civilization as simply a cover for barbarism, hypocrisy, and imperialism since the 1920s, and Trotsky and Stalin in particular wrote quite extensively about this. Communist regimes therefore usually avoided references to civilization directly, preferring other descriptors of socialist culture, humanism, justice, and solidarity to broadcast the values and virtues of their political community. Still, this should not prevent us from seeing how civilization talk actually was quite important in the communist world in its own right. It enjoyed some resonance in the Soviet Union during the Second World War in terms of the fight for civilization against Nazi barbarism, as well as during the Nuremberg trial in Soviet domestic press coverage. Yet it was the communist world's encounter with Asia and Africa in the 1960s when the idea of socialist civilization began to flourish. At that time, the Soviet Union and its allied Eastern European states were engaged in a wide variety of soft power initiatives to build bridges with prospective partners from what we now call the Global South. Included here were kind of education and labor exchanges, the construction of medical facilities and other infrastructure projects, the sponsorship of folk festivals, archaeology expeditions, literary festivals, and filmmaking, all of which were designed to fortify the alliance of the Second and Third World for the cause of international socialism. This is a cover of East German magazine from 1953. This is, in a sense, more for Eastern European consumption. All the kind of groups on Eastern Europe displaying the kind of folklore costumes and styling, the idea of a kind of unity and diversity model. And this, a little bit more typical from a Soviet brochure called To Know Each Other in 1967, in which you then have a number of in this case, Sudanese students performing music in Moscow, and then you have the Bolshoi Ballet performing in Cairo in 1967. This idea of, in a sense, the exchange between Africa and Eastern Europe as part of a broader traffic to bring these areas of the world together. So in that way, social humanism and social civilization became terms of choice to convey a kind of anti-imperial fraternity with the developing world. Now, what's more, Eastern Europeans' modernization crusade abroad became a socialist version of the Civilizing Mission, as the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and especially Yugoslavia developed a remarkable network of cultural connections across Africa. And then I give you a couple examples here. This is a Polish project, International Trade Fair in Accra in 1967, this idea of kind of using kind of Eastern European modernity as a kind of effort to extend a hand then to the developing world. This is some East German architecture, in this case housing projects, in Zanzibar in mid-1960s. But there was also, I'll leave that in a second, but there's also a flip side to this modernization drive that is rarely remarked in the literature, and that is the extent to which Eastern Europeans dedicated a great deal of energy to championing the preservation of indigenous African traditions in the name of anti-imperialism, international solidarity, and social civilization. Archaeology, folk art, and traditional dance were embraced as a cultural means to unite Eastern Europe and Africa. These are just some examples of a lot of in this case, Eastern European interest in African mass. Huge amount of scholarship produced in the 1960s, this idea of kind of linking ancient African culture to kind of modern Eastern Europe. This is just showed Tito becomes one of the real ambassadors for this particular message. Obviously, is a key figure, Eastern European leader, also one of the leaders of the non-alignment movement. So here he is visiting Selassie in 1955, and then of course a few years later, 1968, he's with Nasser, kind of touring the Aswan Dam in a sense that kind of one is an embracing of more traditional culture with this idea of traditional headdress, and in the embrace of kind of modernity on the image on the right. And these are actually quite typical of this particular period. So here and elsewhere, you get a kind of blend of modernity and a kind of embracing of African tradition as a kind of favorite point of cultural diplomacy and cooperation between the second and third worlds in the age of decolonization. This is just to show you. This is one of Tito's trips to, in this case, Kenya in 1970. You get a feeling of the kind of cycle, kind of the things that they were doing on these visits. This is Jovanka, his wife. They were the kind of first couple of the non-aligned world. She's visiting a kind of the Maasai tribe in the top left. She's receiving a brooch there. And then on the top right, you can't see it very well, Tito himself is visiting the Maasai tribe. He's looking through a microscope. There on the middle or toward the bottom right is a kind of science and animal husbandry, and on the bottom right he's looking at some cocoa beans. In a sense, he becomes also a kind of man of science and not just a kind of respect for these particular traditions. Okay, so with all this in mind, how then did the right succeed in commandeering the term for their own conservative and racial purposes? How do we get from this world to what happens then from the 70s onward? To answer this question, we need to recall developments from the late 60s onward, especially the backlash against the kind of left liberal developments from the late 60s onward, especially within conservative quarters. In Southern Europe, for example, some of the most authoritarian regimes, such as Franco's Spain and the Colonel's Greece after 1967, justified their political order for their ability to protect what they called Christian civilization from the dangers of communism and modernity. Of course, the same terminology could be found among European imperial powers Britain, Belgium, France, and Portugal, whose leaders and ideologues repeatedly revived the old language of the civilizing mission to explain the restoration of empire after the Second World War, particularly when faced with strong criticism at the United Nations from representatives from newly decolonized countries. And let's not forget the rhetoric that the rhetoric of civilization and barbarism was central to the Algerian War from both sides to legitimate political violence. Elsewhere in Africa, the once progressive language of civilization began to migrate from earlier understandings of moral reconstruction, anti-colonialism, and anti-Westernism to help bolster various conservative regimes and causes under pressure. The most famous, of course, is apartheid South Africa, whose leaders, such as Hendrik Verwoerd, described their state as a necessary bastion of Christian civilization, anti-communism, and economic liberalism. And you know, these kinds of signs, of course, were rife at the time, as they were, of course, in the American South. Rhodesia, too, was coming under fire from the international community and promoted the idea of civilization in trouble to defend its rule. So in the 60s, countries like Greece, Spain, South Africa, Rhodesia all summoned the rhetoric of civilization against the forces of democracy, equality, and human rights. And it should be noted that the conservative seizure of the term took place at a moment when the European left was abandoning the idea of progressive civilization, in part because the right had been so effective in making it their own. By the mid-1960s, the advocacy of rights, both civil and human, had supplanted civilization as the preferred leftist language of universalism, equality, and international solidarity. So in that way, the left had abandoned that language and the right that essentially had monopolized it. The result was that the open-minded, pluralistic, and secular idea of civilization after 1945 had been reworked in Europe's southern periphery and in the colonial outposts in Africa as a discourse of reaction, anti-communism, and white privilege. Now, at first glance, this mutation may look like a reversion back to 19th century imperial roots, but I think that's misleading, for in this post-imperial setting, civilization was less a rationale for expansion and social engineering than a passionate defense of the status quo and European nativist interests. In other words, the call to protect civilization in trouble became for some the last stand of pariah states and segregationist entities. But it was during the early 70s when things changed dramatically, especially in relationship to the retreat from what is often called, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, retreat from multiculturalism. This was already happening in the 60s as Western European countries, Britain, France, Holland, and elsewhere, were trying to accommodate the arrival of new immigrants as part of the process of decolonization. Enoch Powell's famous River of Blood speech from 1968, the founding of the Nouvelle Droite, that same year, and the creation, of course, of Jean-Marie Le Pen's Front National in France in 1972 were key markers of how anti-immigration was remaking European politics. The right-wing assault on a mixed national culture played a central role in undoing many of the 60s dreams of integration and pluralism. For Le Pen, as you know, immigration claims of French citizenship impinged on what he called native French ones in a zero-sum game of identity, and he repeatedly rallied against the corrosive influence of what he called Arab and Islamic culture on the soul of the French nation. Over and over again, the National Front sounded the alarm about Western civilization in crisis, posing the menacing question that if the white race risks submersion by the Third World, then shouldn't one defend itself? With time, mainstream French press began to take the bait. For example, Le Figaro in 1985 published a special issue called Where Will France Be in 30 Years, in which they sensationalized what they felt to be the demographic trends of this story of kind of French decline. There were other seismic shifts that were happening during this period. One is, in a sense, the events that start to happen in Eastern Europe, in particular around issues of religion. The importance of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 deepened the estrangement between Europe and Islam, whose effects were first registered in Eastern Europe, not in Western Europe. While Eastern European elites initially supported Khomeini and his revolution, Eastern European observers were soon troubled by the lack of economic reforms, the amount of violence, and the attacks on leftist movements, and with time, they in a sense started to withdraw from that support. The Soviet Union lost further credibility among Muslim communities after, of course, the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, squandering the good relations with the Arab world they had built up for decades across the Soviet Union. The growing specter of pan-Islam spooked socialist states with sizable Muslim minorities, including Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Soviet Union, after which Arab nationalism was judged by Eastern Europeans as particularly dangerous. And they start then stepping up their security services to actually keep Muslim students and Muslim citizens then under tight surveillance. The point is, in a sense, one in which this idea of a possible idea of a kind of marriage between socialism and Islam started to break down in the 1970s and 1980s. So what you have is a kind of upshot of a new civilizational divide between Eastern Europeans and their Muslim citizens that identified political Islam as obstructing socialist development. So very, very dangerous developments happening then in the 1970s and 80s. In the West, too, this kind of language civilization challenges a kind of pluralist culture. And during the 1980s, the semi-integration of foreigners was a staging post for new identity politics in Britain, France, and West Germany, especially after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So in that way, you have a situation in which the integration or non-integration of Muslim citizens became a kind of litmus test for the viability of a national culture. What this meant was that the defensive language of a white minority culture under threat in the colonial outposts of South Africa and Rhodesia in the 60s now came home to the metropole in the guise of the preservation of monoculturalism for the religious and racial majority. These cultural wars over minorities only intensified, exploding, of course, in two events in 1989, the Salman Rushdie affair in Britain, and of course the headscarf debate in France in 1979. So this is probably a little bit less known to you. And the sensationalist language of civilization and crisis was central to both of them. And in recent decades, and you know this, I don't need to really go through this material in terms of the influence of the kind of Renaud Camus kind of characters and this idea of the kind of grand remplacement, in terms of, in a sense, ratcheting up this idea of so-called reverse colonization and this idea of kind of ethnic and civilizational substitution, the kind of power and influence of this kind of rhetoric in this kind of world of alt-right platforms and political mobilization. So it's one in which that story, which was confined to the colonial outposts in the 1960s, boomerangs back then, I think, to Europe in the 1980s and 90s in a defense of majoritarian culture. Okay, so where does this leave us? And I've just got a little bit longer, if that's okay. To me, what has happened in recent years is quite noteworthy for European history. Civilization has been perhaps the most cherished of invented traditions on the continent, and now is being fully redefined by the right in three distinct ways. First, in the 18th and 19th century guises, civilization was always about the transformation and improvement of people, for good or ill. It was closely associated with forced and violent change, be it Christianization or Westernization abroad, or class politics at home. But it could also be linked to the rule of law, civility, and mutual respect. The murky rhetoric of the Civilizing Mission captured both of these impulses, most famously explored by Norbert Elias in his 1939 book, The Civilizing Process. The key point is that historically, civilization has been more about a process than a destination. Or put differently, it has functioned more as a verb than a noun. And etymologically, this is how it started. To civilize preceded the noun civilization by several decades in the 18th century. In the hands of 21st century political leaders, mentioned at the start of the talk, from Xi to Orban to Macron, civilization is now exclusively a noun, not a verb. It is not based on action, process, or transformation, but rather is summoned as a defense of the status quo, one that grants legitimacy to the political present and its leaders by claiming that they are the rightful heirs and custodial guardians of ancient heritage, be it Hindu civilization in India, Hittite civilization in Turkey, or Christian civilization in Hungary. To my mind, Putin, in his assault on Ukraine, has directly challenged this new orthodoxy of a defensive idea of civilization in crisis, one that has been weaponized to defend Russian civilization under threat as he sees it, and has once again become a language of expansionism and conquest. For Putin and these others, civilization has been easily retrofitted by populist leaders who do not demand that their people change or improve. On the contrary, this populist version of civilization is a celebration of a proud present as the natural successor to an ancient and glorious past, whose government seeks to guard its borders with renewed vigilance. Showcasing this kind of ancestor worship is an easy way to conjure up majoritarian identity and history without any claim or obligation to betterment, as opposed to engaging with the more concrete political concepts of democracy, justice, or rights. And unlike its earlier versions, today's conservative understanding of civilization, be it in Europe or elsewhere, does not seek cultural interaction or mutual understanding, but rather offers a mystique of self-regard, distance from others, and a demand for outside recognition. Secondly, civilization may have always been about identity politics, but it is worth recalling that it was originally conceived as the expression of regional identities that preceded and or transcended nation states, be Christian, European, Celtic, Thracian, Slavic, African, Asia, etc., was beyond the idea of the nation state. Today, however, it stands above all as the cultural corollary of national sovereignty that must be protected by a sentry state from the virus of globalization, be it Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, or Russian civilization, in the way that it's being recast in the 21st century. Thirdly, the left liberal counter-heritage of civilization as the expansion of peace, liberty, and justice, rights and democracy, which were so prominent after the Second World War, has been discarded and no longer seen as relevant. Today, invocations of civilization are not about progress or even the future, but rather sit squarely in the political present based on a nostalgic gaze backwards toward a mythic and affirmative past. Such a transformation may mark the shift of the term from tragedy to farce, but it still remains a powerful weapon in the culture wars to shore up vulnerable national identities and their national leaders in an age of anxious globalization. Of course, there have always been and still are important counter voices that defend more peaceful, inclusive, and multicultural ideas of European or world civilization, from Václav Havel to V.S. Naipaul, from Gorbachev to UNESCO, and there are a whole series of those other voices. And COVID has seen calls for cooperative ideas of planetary civilization in danger. So the turbulent history of the term's career over the last 200 years suggests that there's no reason to think that it won't keep mutating in the future. Nevertheless, ours is an era in which civilization rhetoric has become hijacked by the right, and it is worth reflecting on what this means for our changing understanding of European values and their reception. In this sense, this is the last few sentences, in this sense, the deep tensions that bedeviled the San Francisco conference back in 1945 have shaped the development of European affairs ever since. And the rich and progressive history after 1945, above all its commitment to peace, decolonization, and multiculturalism, has been overrun by today's extremist visions of the crisis civilization in Europe and elsewhere. How civilization will be drafted to narrate political fear and majoritarian identity in Europe remains an open question, but it continues to animate and define a continent that feels itself under threat. Anyway, thanks.
So thank you so much, Paul, for this wide range perspective on European and international history too. We have time for question, remark, comments, and after that we have a nice drink. We can also continue, if you don't have time to pick all the questions, to continue the discussion after the moment now, but you have, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes? Okay. Peter?
Thank you. I have a question on how the concept of civilization relates to that other central concept in San Francisco, in Nuremberg, of humanity. It would seem that humanity, you can oppose civilization, civilized to uncivilized, human to unhuman, and it's always about who the others are. How are we different in a way from Nazi Germany? And it seems that in the end, in Nuremberg, it is humanity that wins out. Justice Jackson might have mentioned crimes against civilization, but it is in the end crimes against humanity that will be under judgment. And I think even organizations like UNESCO will refer to humanity and humankind as a much more universalist, probably egalitarian, probably also political notion, referring maybe to a promise of democracy compared to civilization, which would be more cultural and in a way much less egalitarian and maybe much less political. So how would you see the place or the kind of competition between a universalist concept of humanity and a much more specific unegalitarian concept like civilization?
Should I answer that? That's an excellent question, Peter. Thank you. I had worked quite a long time on the history of humanity as a concept, and I expected before I had written this book that I would try to braid them together. And I realized in many ways they go in different directions. I mean, you're right, 1945 with Nuremberg, with the United Nations Conference, there's a way in which they're often seen as kind of synonyms. They're working through an idea with the civilization, trying to cleanse it of its kind of racist imperial past to, in a sense, give it a language of creating something very, very new. What I wanted to do, though, in the end, I decided to, I mean, you're right, of course, with the crimes against humanity, it becomes a legal term, and civilization is dropped by international law and then moves into areas of material welfare, of issues of religion, science, as I was kind of marking out. And so that term humanity becomes an important kind of legal story. What I wanted to do really in the end, it took me a while to work this through, was to try to write a history of Europe after 1945 around moments in which the debate and controversy around civilization would flare up around certain crises and moments. And so I decided in the end, humanity does have a history, but it's one in which it's, I think maybe given its 18th century background, it is one in which it becomes it's faster to include lots of people. It is, by definition, universalist, right? I mean, there will be, socialists in the 60s will talk about an idea of socialist humanity, which is different from the Western world. So sometimes it's not all that universal, but for the most part it is. It just doesn't generate the same amount of controversy and scandal. And in a sense, what I was looking at was, in a sense, these debates around moments of civilization, because I think they become mirrors of much deeper discussions of European identity in terms of how Europe's trying to position itself in the world of 1945. I was trying to rehabilitate, let's say, certain and salvageable cultural traditions. And humanity in that way, despite the fact it has 18th century roots, it's very much a term of the present. It's not one in which people are writing histories of that term very much. And so civilization, the power of that term is that it's a term that links people across time, right? It's often kind of an ancient idea of identity to the present, but also across space, where you're thinking way beyond the idea of the nation state in terms of a kind of regional or world civilization. It becomes a term where people can kind of map out their place in time and history and space. And so I felt that it was a term that was much more not just controversial, but much more present from the 50s right through the 80s. And in the discussion around those particular controversies, you could actually read a lot of moments of European history differently. So in that way, I was expecting to weave in the history of humanities, the term, more concretely. But when it came down to, for example, of people building new welfare states, and that becomes one leftist place, they talk about civilization as building, let's say, hospitals, schools, mass literacy, medicine, all these things were seen as a kind of material expression of civilization. So, and that, you don't have the language of humanity around those particular things. It's much more of a kind of legal discussion and more of an abstract idea of trying to imagine a world based on sameness as opposed to difference in the Second World War. So for example, the famous 1955 photography show, Family of Man, that kind of, and that's often translated in other languages as humanity. It'd be the idea of a kind of photo album of what it is we all have in common. But I think for most people, there was, of course, a kind of interesting Soviet reception history of that book. It's one in which it's very inclusive, it's quite well accepted. It doesn't seem to generate that kind of debate and controversy. So in a sense, I wanted to write a history of Europe in 1945 driven by these practical reform initiatives, take it out of the world of just people writing books and philosophizing, and see how it actually operated in the world and how people thought that they were trying to make things better or changing things in the name of this concept. And humanity, I found, doesn't do that kind of work. It's a very important term that's hanging around as a kind of idea of something universal and all-embracing, but it's not generating that sense of political contour. May have looked in the wrong places. It could be of places elsewhere, but that's in a sense why I decided to leave it as not just a conceptual history, where and under what circumstances people are invoking the term to write about Europe in the world. And I also wanted to take it outside of just the story of the superpowers. It's very easy, I think, to write a story of Cold War Europe, in which is of the Soviet Union and the United States. Civilization gave a chance for a lot of Europeans to use their own voice in terms of trying to map out who they were, what part of the past they can actually retrieve, and how they understand their relationship to other parts of the world. And that humanity does not do that kind of work.
Thank you. So, when it comes to that conservative turn that seemingly occurs in the 1960s, I was wondering whether the countercultures of that time, how they come into the picture. Because finally, for instance, you mentioned the cases of Francoist Spain or the colonialist Greece, in which this idea of the Christian civilization was at the very core of military rule and the coup d'état itself in the case of Greece. And it's actually a common pattern that's also shared by dictatorships in the South Cone, meaning that finally there is a reaction against what might seem communist or so, but there is also a sense of reaction against modernity, actually pop music or the new youth cultures in general. They were actually quite stigmatized the same way as political aspects were. So finally, how do the youth cultures and countercultures actually of the 1960s contributed to fuel that idea of a conservative turn in terms of Western civilization and so on?
Good question. When I started with that image of Kenneth Clark from his show Civilization 1969, that was in many ways an effort also to restore an idea of Western art, in the sense of a kind of decade of pop art, art povera, in a sense this kind of constant challenging of Western art, to kind of restate its importance by giving a kind of almost a kind of family tree of Western heritage. So that was a kind of, I think, I mean, it was very successful, but a kind of rearguard act, in a sense, defend something that was very much under attack. One thing I found interesting too is that by the mid-60s, you were talking about the counterculture world, they never used the term, right? I mean, it's not a term that student radicals will use, because it's so much, I think, the perception has been locked up by the right that, you know, it's much more about establishment, and civilization would be seen as a classic establishment value. But there's not to say that they're advancing a student radical politics in the name of civilization. That language is not there. It's much more about kind of concrete language about kind of rights, issues of freedom, liberty, imagination, all the things we kind of know around, let's say, 1968. So that's a group, that's already one clue that certainly by the mid-60s, young people don't feel that that's a vehicle to advance progressive politics. You rarely get, let's say, feminists using that language. That's not a language that they feel will help them in terms of driving forward a story of emancipation, rights, et cetera. So labor unions also not using the language of civilization. They will use, in the 40s, they'll talk about the idea of again, schools, health services, a kind of world of paid holidays as a kind of broad sense of material civilization, but it's not used in that way by leftist either groups or students. So, but it's certainly one used by the right against the counterculture. This idea that suddenly anything hippie culture, kind of the pop music, the challenging of authority, all these things are then part of this language of the crisis of civilization. So that in a sense becomes a ratcheted up, nervous, sensationalist, defensive reaction to modernity and a kind of youth culture that seems to no longer kind of respect the kind of the norms and the niceties of the past. So it becomes what I was trying to mark out is that it's a wide open story after 1945. Lots of different groups have a stake in it because they're all trying to think of this as a kind of rhetoric or a kind of language of transformation. By the mid-60s, it's really, really shifted as a kind of right-wing identity politics. And then what you get from, I think, I mean, of course, there are some exceptional stories, but essentially from the early 70s then to the present, it's one in which it's been essentially run much more by the right. I mean, you had, you know, again, flare-up moments here and there. I mean, the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, all the kind of photography around ethnic cleansing was a sense in which this seems to be, again, a moment of kind of civilization and crisis. But 1989, for example, there's no language there. This is really about civilization, other than you get a few right-wing Americans talking about that this is a kind of civilization of Eastern Europe. But that's not really very strong, not very powerful. It's much more the language of democracy and freedom. Those become much stronger, concrete, practical kind of languages of reform. So it kind of dips in and out. But I mean, it was really quite surprising and quite shocking for me to work this through. And it's become, I think, actually a very, very dangerous story. And is one in which that language is used to justify very rough and violent politics. And I think Putin's use of it is just the latest iteration. But you have, you know, very defensive language of Chinese civilization, of course. And it's usually one defending state sovereignty above all. But it's now different with Putin, where it suddenly becomes a language of being on the road, in which it's actually about the acquisition of territory, this idea of denying Ukraine's existence in the name of Russian civilization. So we'll see how that goes, but it's been a live, volatile, toxic, and quite dangerous concept for a long time. But there was a moment, I think, from 45 to 65 in which it was quite open, as being used by lots of different groups. But because it was being used by, let's say, African anti-colonial elites, I think part of the backlash in places like South Africa and Rhodesia were reaction to how it was being used. And then it circles back to, I think, Europe in the 1970s and becomes a defense of majoritarian culture in ways that I think we still live with. That was my sense in terms of trying to plot out how the term shifts context and becomes one as a kind of license to crack down in the name of something cultural and good, because it really had a much more kind of liberal, open, even leftist view. And I was trying in the book to recall the diversity of usages, because they were, in a sense, identity politics coming from all directions. Now we have one in which that language has been abandoned, I think, by liberals and leftists They don't think there's anything in it. But that abandonment by the left we pay for that. In other words, the right then locks this up and then uses that language to justify and legitimate a range of really, I think, quite dark political agendas. So I mean, that abandonment has come at a cost. And I was saying, I'm not here to rehabilitate the term. And I think humanity is, I'm much more happy with that. I mean, if civilization stands for inclusivity, multiculturalism, and peace, I'm happy with that. And it certainly did at certain points, it did stand for that. But it has moved in different directions. And I think most of us are uncomfortable with the term because of what it has become. But it's not always been that way. There have always been these counter currents. But I think it's one in which, if people are interested in retrieving it, it'll be a lot of work to do to cleanse it of all this contamination. But humanity is a much more neutral term. And me personally, I'm much more comfortable with the idea of thinking about, let's say, the human family. It doesn't have this, this political legacy that civilization does. But because the civilization is it's an older term, it's political, it's highly charged, and it's one that really has a powerful political presence in our world. And so in a sense, trying to take that seriously, that we shouldn't just constantly dismiss it as the stuff that we don't need to care about because it's used. And now it's being used to help justify military intervention in the case of Ukraine.
Thank you so much.